Devices like the Steam Deck and the Nintendo Switch are a retro gaming fan's dream. Emulation is made easy with the Steam Deck, but if you're worried about the murky legality aspect of it, the Switch is a great way to go. Nintendo brought a number of classics via its NSO service from past consoles to the system, allowing fans to enjoy classic Mario, Zelda, and more titles, but also other games from other third-party companies. And speaking of these companies, many of them have done a great job of bringing their games to this system. For more on this, check out my video on the myriad of game collections I've released. I'll include a link to it in the description below. While all of these collections are great, they're not all a perfect list. What makes being able to play these games now on current gen systems is that these ports help old games have new life. It can garner attention to an old game or series, which could breathe new life in it, so as long as the property owner of said series feels they want a full-fledged remaster, remake, or even sequel. And put quite simply, being able to have ease of accessibility to play these is what makes something like game preservation easier. Ultimately, when fan-favorite games don't get ports, it makes emulation seem like that much more of a valid way to play titles otherwise not possible. Additionally, some ports may not be possible or become more difficult due to licensing issues. This leads to a good segue to what games you may not see on my list here in this video. The first cut includes not listing any sports or racing titles. It's not impossible to get a number of car brands or sport athletes to play ball for a port, but honestly I feel the effort would be better served in a remaster or even remake of said title rather than just a simple port. And of course it's not totally impossible, as it's happened with ports of NES's Tecmo Bowl or arcade 1-up cabinets of NBA Jam, for example. Another set of games I'm not going to list? Pokemon titles. Which, funny enough, Nintendo ported a number of these to the Nintendo 3DS eShop, but it's yet to be seen if they'll add it to the NSO at all. And while these are all fan favorites, Nintendo has done a number of remakes of them as well. Overall, Pokemon titles get plenty of love in their own right, and that there's probably no need to say games like Pokemon Red and Blue anyway. So here's my list of games that I believe need ports to current gen systems. I've also made another video listing many games I'd like to see remakes or remasters of. There may be some crossover, but the current video you're watching now will just focus on ports. So let's get porting. So starting off, and surprisingly, Nintendo's got a number of games that I'd like to see them port from their back catalog. Maybe the Zelda CDI series and Hotel Mario, as well as the Mario-named games they released on the Virtual Boy, would be fun curiosities, but Nintendo knows that these were failed games and/or from failed systems. They wouldn't touch them with a 10-foot polecat. Instead, I'll make a couple suggestions that were banner releases from their retro systems. And with that in mind, I'd love to see them port Gyromite from the NES. And it was an early game from the system which used Rob the Robot as a controller. It could still be controlled with NES controllers plugged into the first and second ports, and there'd be a way to port it to allow one single controller to function with it. And it's not the most complex game, but the puzzles and the modes that were in there were still pretty fun. Another suggestion would be the Super Nintendo Tetris and Dr. Mario game. Essentially, it's a 2-for-1, 16-bit version of both games, but there's also a mixed match mode that allows Tetris B-Type, a round of Dr. Mario, and Tetris A-Type to be played in that order, with players competing against one another for the high score in a given time limit. And while individually these titles were great, this combined mode really made the game for me. And finally, I'd love the Nintendo-published version of Super Nintendo's SimCity to be ported as well. I felt like it simplified and made the original PC version more digestible for families and kids, of which I appreciated at the time of its original release. Controller configuration may slow Gyromite, and already having over 4 versions of Tetris on the Switch would probably stop Tetris and Dr. Mario. I can't even imagine the licensing nightmare it'd be to get SimCity ported today. It was from 2006 to 2013 for Wii's Virtual Console, but I'm sure current license owner EA wanted a king's ransom for continued licensing there. And honestly, after the train wreck of 2013's SimCity, positive spotlight on an older version of the game would serve them well to reinvigorate said brand name. Let's move on to Sega, who has a number of titles that honestly doesn't have as many ports on my list here. I do chalk this up to my limited history of playing their games, but there's a bigger reason for why Sega's list is smaller. This company probably has done one of the best jobs out of any video game company to re-release their games for past and present current-gen consoles. And even today, a bunch of these games can be played on the NSO expansion pack, as well as the Sega Genesis Classics Collection. So the games I'm going to list, oddly enough, are still not on any of these collections. And right at the top of my list is the cult classic Rocket Knight Adventures from the Sega Genesis. This isn't another bland 90s animal mascot-led game. Stages are varied and fun, with gameplay that crosses platforming and speed elements with a great amount of action. Being developed by Konami, it's no surprise the game is so good and Sparksters controls so well. I'd like this game ported so much that even Sonic took a backseat to it, as it's topped my list for Sega. To that end, the set of Sonic games I do want to see ported is Sonic Advance 1 through 3 from the Game Boy Advance. And when these first came out, I was still in a bit of shock to see Sonic running so quickly and so well on a blast processing-less Nintendo system. But make no mistake, these 3 games are fantastic. I was disappointed to hear that the physical version of Sonic Origins that was announced decided to port only a number of Game Gear Sonic titles and not these. To that end, why are they porting the Game Gear versions of these and not the Sega Master System ones? The Game Gear was essentially a portable version of the Sega Master System, Sega's 8-bit home console, which wasn't as popular in the US like it was in Japan. The opposite held true for the Genesis, funnily enough. And while we're at it, Sega, please just port Knuckles Chaotix from the 32X already. I've never had a chance to play this game, and while I've heard mixed reviews from it, I'm still surprised it's never appeared on one of their Sonic collections before. It implemented a partner system which was revisited later in Sonic Advance 3. Unfortunately, I don't know nearly as many titles from other consoles like the TurboGrafx 16. If there's anything from this console or any others that you'd recommend, make sure to let me know in the comments section below, and while you're there, please like or dislike my video and subscribe for more content. Speaking of more content, let's talk about Capcom. While they're tearing it up today with franchises like Street Fighter, Resident Evil, and Monster Hunter, I'd love to see some back catalog classics get ported. One such game would be Rockman and Forte, originally released late in the life of the Super Nintendo in Japan only. It was ported later to the Game Boy Advance in 2003, but nothing since then. I felt this game was what Mega Man 8 should have been, as Rockman and Forte was fun and challenging while also avoiding the cringy voice acting and dialogue. And you know what would be great to pair with this? Its little-known sequel, Rockman and Forte Mirai Kara no Chozensha, released for the Japan-only WonderSwan in 1999. And speaking of obscure Mega Man titles, let's get ports of Mega Man 1 and 3 for PC. These are DOS-based games that honestly have some odd physics, but I loved the idea of playing a Mega Man game on my old 386 PC when I was a kid, especially years before emulation was even a thing. While keeping Capcom in our thoughts and prayers, like any good Murica does, let's get the original NES Bionic Commando ported as well. While we've got the arcade version on Capcom's arcade collection for all major consoles, this NES gem still isn't available. Let's also get the Bionic Commando Rearmed ported as well. This was a great remake of the original game, chock full of great action and funny story dialogue. I'd like to see a number of RPGs see ports to current-gen systems. Besides Wii Virtual Console, Final Fantasy Mystic Quest for the Super Nintendo hasn't seen any recent release on any collections at all. This was Squaresoft's attempt at creating an easy RPG for the likes of us simple-minded Americans. This simplicity, however, actually makes it more of a comfort food game, while it also has a surprisingly great soundtrack. Speaking of SNES RPGs, let's get the Heaven and Earth trilogy ported already. This includes the classics Soul Blazer, Illusion of Gaia, and Terranigma. I can't speak enough how fantastic these action RPGs are. I also feel Square Enix missed the boat in not including Secret of Evermore in the Mana collection they released a couple years ago. Yes, it may not be part of the Mana series per se, but Evermore's gameplay is so similar to Secret of Mana. And while I've never played these, I've heard great things for Lufia and Lufia 2, Rise of the Sinistrals. While these two are turn-based RPGs, the latter game did get a remake on the DS in a revamped action RPG type system. Regarding action RPG games, I'd love to see Faxanadu and Battle of Olympus from the NES get ported. While these lean more into action and platforming than RPG mechanics per se, they're still fantastic games that should get played again. One last series to suggest that's a little bit obscure would be Sword of Hope 1 and 2 from the original Game Boy. These are truly unique for its time as they mix the point-and-click exploration similar to how games like Shadowgate ran, while also employing a full turn-based RPG battle system. A couple other classics from the NES specifically I'd love to see would include games from the Wizards and Warriors series by Rareware. Although the third and final game, I could take it or leave it. These had extremely challenging and, let's be honest, sometimes often unfair gameplay and fantastic music. Surprisingly, these entries are not on the Rare Replay collection exclusively on Xbox consoles. I'm still crossing my fingers we'll get this game on the Switch and or PC Steam. I'd also love to see Base Wars ported again, as it's one of the few sports games I played growing up, especially from the sport of baseball. I love the battle mechanics, the equipment customization, team and league customization, and overall gameplay. One game that doesn't get near enough attention that it should would be The Guardian Legend. Did you love Nier Automata's mix of shoot 'em up and Android-controlled gameplay? Guardian Legend did it first. I'm also a sucker for puzzle games on this system. I'd love to see Hatris get a port, or at least be included on an Alexei Pajitnov-based puzzle collection, as he had a hand in creating this simple puzzler. Now, if you noticed, I haven't even talked about licensed games at all. As I mentioned before, these are often difficult, but not impossible, to get ported to current-gen systems. And there's no guarantee that they'll stay on console online shops if they do get them ported and released. Funny enough, many of these titles have a notorious reputation for not being great, perhaps thanks to developers like LJN. Regardless, there are a lot of diamonds in this pile of coal. This is evidenced by games like Batman for the NES. While it is loosely based on the 1989 movie, this game has Ninja Gaiden vibes because of its gameplay, albeit not as fast-paced. Great music, fantastic gameplay, and an iconic hero helped cement this as one of the earliest and best Batman adaptations. Another great movie adaptation game would be Willow on the NES. While I wasn't a huge fan of the movie, the game was a fantastic action RPG from Capcom. Unlike similar counterpart of Legend of Zelda, Willow used very long strings of passwords. Maybe if this got ported, they could use a save feature, or at the very least, save states. While we're on the discussion of movie games from this era, let's talk about Top Gun. And leave it where it's at. While the sprite work in Top Gun is fantastic, the 3 lives and no continues aspect and that painful landing sequence is enough to induce millennial flashbacks of our own. While looking into ports, I was going to suggest Castle of Illusion starring Mickey Mouse, that originally released on the Sega Genesis. This did get a remake in 2013, along with PlayStation Network pre-order bonus of the original game. So why not port this again, along with the sequel, World of Illusion, on the Genesis? To that end, I feel Sega and Disney should collaborate and listen, and come up with a brand new invention. That is, of course, a Mickey Mouse collection that includes all of the Disney games that they released for the Sega Genesis. Quackshot, Land of Illusion, all are fair game. Maybe Disney could spearhead the effort and get multiple publishers to play ball, so they could get titles like Maui Mallard that was multi-platform, as well as the Nintendo-based Magical Quest series. They've done Disney collections before, as seen with Disney Afternoon Collection and the Disney Classic Games Collection. While on the topic of animation, I'd love to see G.I. Joe, a real American hero from the NES, get ported too. Okay, so maybe this entry is probably more based on the general toy line, but there was the campy 80s cartoon. The video game itself isn't really campy, and in fact, it's quite the competent action platformer. Series favorites such as Duke, Snake Eyes, Blizzard, and Captain Gridiron are selectable, with up to a total of 6 playable characters. While 1 character is automatically selected per each stage, the player can select 2 additional characters and can switch between them in the middle of the stage, akin to the first NES Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles game. Speaking of, I fortunately don't have to ask for any of the old school ones to be ported, as we have the Cowabunga collection that captures all of the old school classics, especially Turtles in Time. But if I'm asking for animated series, I'd love to see Tiny Toons Buster Bust Loose from the Super Nintendo get ported. With the reboot titled Tiny Toons Looniversity coming this year, porting some of the classics from this cartoon series would be awesome. And with great platforming, speedy sections, and plenty of great references, Buster Busts Loose is the best of the Tiny Toons video games. I know there are a bunch of Looney Tunes games, like Bugs Bunny Crazy Castle, that would be apt for a port collection too. The next few games I'll touch upon are animated, and in fact they're based on anime. They were released at a time when I actually wasn't into anime and didn't know the first two games I'll mention. I'm of course speaking about Little Nemo the Dream Master for the NES and UN Squadron for the SNES. Little Nemo was based on a Japanese anime movie released in 1989. The game follows Nemo as he has to find keys to unlock the exit for each individual stage, and befriend animals with candy to unlock their abilities. This one's a decent platformer, but the soundtrack is amazing, especially that boss theme. Regarding UN Squadron, thanks to Jeremy Parish's video works, link to his video on the subject is in the description below, was how I found out it was based on an anime called Area 88. In fact, this game was released with the title Area 88 in Japan for the Super Famicom and in the arcades. The game itself is a fantastic shoot-'em-up. While it's not an easy one, it does allow for some mistakes, insofar as one hit not killing the player right off, and the health bar can somewhat regenerate. Players are rewarded for shooting down enemies with cash that can be reinvested to upgrade their jets, buy wholly new ones, and additional special weapons. And regarding anime, I would love it if the Super Famicom release of Dragon Ball Z Hyper Dimension was ported as well. This fighting game plays reminiscent to Street Fighter II, but with a roster full of Dragon Ball Z characters from the tail end of the Buu saga. I remember getting into Emulation at the same time I got into Dragon Ball Z on TV and finding this game. I wondered why there were all of these different variations of some of the characters I knew of. Why is Gohan grown up but not Super Saiyan? Why does Vegeta have an M on his forehead? And why is Kirby in the game and have an antenna on his head? Hey, give me a break now. It was the year 2000 when I first played it, and I was just getting into the Cell Saga on TV. So that's my list of ported games, and as you can tell, it was quite a lot. Make sure to let me know in the comments section below what I missed, because I guarantee I missed games that you'd like. As you can tell, because I'm old, I lean more heavily into titles from the 8-bit and 16-bit eras. Because of that, I have a fair bit more nostalgia for these than stuff from the aughts in the last decade. That doesn't make those years' games any worse or better, we just all have our own preferences. The important thing is that we continue to enjoy and celebrate all of these fantastic games, as well as show companies like Nintendo, Sega, and the like that we'd still like to play games from their early days. I love playing new games, but nothing beats playing a simpler one from a bygone era.